Welcome back to the read along of the book Pentagon 9/11 by Alfred Goldberg. This is chapter 1, part 2 of the book called The Attack. For their assault on the U.S. homeland on September 11, 2001, the terrorists identified as belonging to the Al-Qaeda network headed by Osama bin Laden chose 4 targets known to the world as prominent symbols of American prestige and power. The first 2, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York, were icons representing American economic strength. The third, the Pentagon, represented U.S. military might. A fourth and highest value target selected, presumably the White House or the Capitol, escaped attack when the hijacked plane destined for it crashed in Pennsylvania. Previous attacks against U.S. official facilities by radical Muslim terrorists had occurred overseas, most notably the suicide truck bombing that killed 241 American military at the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, in October of 1983. A similar strike against the Air Force Khobar Towers housing complex in Saudi Arabia in June of 96. The massive attacks on the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in August of 98, and the small boat bombing of the destroyer USS Cole in Yemen's port of Aden in October of 2000. The only strike within the United States by Middle Eastern terrorists occurred in February of 93 when they exploded a truck bomb in a parking garage under the World Trade Center in New York City, killing 6 people. Before 2001, the Al-Qaeda terrorists had decided to aim at the more high-value and high-visibility targets in the United States. Now, this is not painting the whole picture, is that bin Laden wanted to invite the American military to Afghanistan similarly to what the Soviets did in Afghanistan in 1979. Dragged them out to a 10-year war, 11-year war, drained their economy and also their resources, to basically, they would bleed them dry, defeat them militarily by picking them off one by one and not, go head at them. This was the same concept that bin Laden thought of the United States. Now, bin Laden basically didn't know whether the Americans would respond because after the embassy attacks in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, President Clinton didn't invade Afghanistan, which surprised bin Laden, actually. He was more respectful of Clinton than he was with Bush, but Bush gave him an extra surprise. Not only did the military invade Afghanistan, but they invaded Iraq as well. So this basically drained trillions of dollars because with Afghanistan was over $3 trillion in 20 years, and I believe it was close to $1 trillion in Iraq. That money was wasted on the War Department. And basically it was a failure because Iraq was an illegal invasion. Afghanistan was a 20-year war, which basically saw Taliban take over the country with U.S. leaving in 2021. Weren't we there to destroy the Taliban to begin with? No, we weren't, because if the real reason was to destroy Al-Qaeda and Taliban, they wouldn't have existed in the first place. We could easily destroy them, but they serve a useful purpose, and that is that we could use them later when they regroup and regain their strength and act as an international threat like Al-Qaeda used to be. Over a period of 2 years before September 2001, in accordance with plans conceived by a network of Al-Qaeda plotters, the chosen agents entered the United States and made preparations for their stunning assault. They selected the most practical, lethal, and obtainable means of achieving their purpose. Large flying aircraft, huge loads of explosive fuel. Beginning as early as July of 2000, 14 months before the hijackings, several of the terrorists took flight training courses. They acquired flight deck videos of Boeing 747, 757, 767, and 777 aircraft. By September 2001, the hijackers were ready. On the morning of September 11th, the terrorists hijacked 4 airliners, 2 from Bogan's Logan International Airport, 1 from New York Liberty International Airport, and 1 from Washington Dulles International Airport in Northern Virginia. The 2 aircraft departing Boston, American Airlines Flight 11, which were 11 crews, 76 passengers, 5 hijackers at 7:59 a.m., and United Airlines Flight 175 with 9 crew, 51 passengers, 5 hijackers at 8:14 a.m. They were Boeing 767s bound for Los Angeles. Their flight crews each stopped transmitting within half an hour of departing when they were over central New York State. Air controllers first registered concerns at 8:21 a.m. when American Flight 11 turned off its transponder. The Federal Aviation Administration sent its first warning of the hijackings of American Flight 11 to the Northeast Air Defense Sector needs of the North American Airspace Defense Command, NORAD, at 8:38 a.m. The call from the FAA did not come in time. The military had less than 9 minutes warning before the first airliner hit the World Trade Center and 25 minutes before the second. The Air National Guard launched two F-15 fighter planes from Otis Air Force Base on Cape Cod, Massachusetts at 8:53 a.m., too late to intercept the hijacked aircraft. Flight 11 and 175 hit the north and south towers of the World Trade Center at 8:46 and 9:03 a.m. Now, later on, NORAD would testify at the 9/11 Commission and asked by one of the commissioners that if the FAA had readily transmitted information to NORAD in time about the hijackings, could they have stopped any of the hijackings at all? And they said yes. Meanwhile, NORAD's timeline at the 9/11 Commission didn't fit with the timeline that the FAA provided. Now, whose fault is that? FAA or NORAD? Well, NORAD was ordered to give a real timeline because the 9/11 Commission said this timeline doesn't even make sense, not even to your own logbooks. NORAD still did. It's 2023. Why? Why didn't they give a right timeline? And why didn't the FAA report the hijackings to NORAD in time when they had available time to them when the calls were coming in that the transponder was turned off and that they lost contact with the crew? Especially with the phone calls that were coming in, known to the New York Center and Boston Centers about 175 and 11. Otis and Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, each with a pair of fighters at the ready, were the only two alert sites available to needs for air defense in New York and Washington. Just 14 fighter planes on alert guarded the whole American airspace that morning. Now, this is not new because during the years prior to 9/11, needs and NORAD basically, through the Department of Defense, eliminated a lot of these fighter jets because there were no preconceived threat matrix reports about hijackings. Because when was the last hijacking in the United States? It wasn't for a very long time. I believe it was PSA 1771 or 1771. The last hijacking, could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. But there hasn't been a hijacking. So this way, and also too, the threat of the Cold War gone, no invading country coming in. So that threat matrix was reported to the principals meetings over the years. So that scaled back production or air defense for the whole country. Even though in 1999-2000, the threat matrix of Al-Qaeda wanting to hijack planes was known to the Department of Defense as well as the White House. So why wasn't that taken into place or taken into the attention of these people at these entities? Why not? I mean, we've known since 95 about the Pentagon plot, which was the original plot to hijack the aircraft or to plant bombs on aircraft, had them all explode over the Pacific. And there was a hidden compartment to that, was that they were going to hijack 10 aircraft using sleeper cells in the United States. This is 95, by the way, 6 years prior to 9/11. And have them all crash over the intercontinental United States. Now, I'm not making this up. This is actually coming from a member of the Bajinka plot named Abdul Hakim Murad, who was interrogated by the Philippines National Police. And he spoke with the commander of the operation, Rodolfo Mendoza, and told him about this hidden compartment to 9/11. So it was known in 95. This was given to the FBI. And according to Director Louis Freeh, he gave it to the FAA, he gave it to the Port Authority, Massachusetts, New York, disseminated to security apparatuses like Argonbright. What did they do? Did they solidify security? No, because that would mean that money had to be spent. A lot of this is malfeasance. A lot of people get this wrong and say, oh, they were all in on it. They knew about 9/11. No, it doesn't work like that. Too many people are involved. Way too many. Malfeasance, ignorance is an epidemic in this country, especially when it comes to people's lives. And we got to spend money, even with the threat matrix saying, hey, wait a minute, there's terrorists that want to hijack planes. The New York City attacks caused the South Tower to collapse at 9:59 a.m., the North Tower at 10:28 a.m., killing more than 2,700 people. 2,700 people. The majority of the 9/11 attacks killed right here. United Flight 93, 7 crew, 33 passengers, 4 hijackers, allegedly. Remember, the phone call said 3. A Boeing 757 bound for San Francisco left Newark at 8:42 a.m. in the morning. At approximately 9:24 a.m., Needs ordered Langley Air Force Base near Norfolk, Virginia, which had been put on alert at 9:09 a.m., to prepare to scramble fighters, presumably to intercept Flight 90, not Flight 93, but Flight 11. So Needs is ordering Langley to intercept Flight 11 because they're getting their information from who? The FAA. The FAA doesn't know that Flight 11 crashed in North Tower. And if they did, then why didn't they relay this in time to Needs, which could have had fighters to intercept 93? But Flight 11 mistakenly thought to be moving south. This almost 40 minutes after Flight 11 had struck the North Tower. Another 40 minutes later, after a struggle between the hijackers and passengers, Flight 93 crashed on the ground near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing all aboard because the FAA mistakenly said that 93 was 11. Needs relayed this to intercepts in Langley and said that you're following 11, and they have no idea. All this is confusion. The conspirators no doubt chose and methodically planned to take over these particular flights to maximize explosive damage. Because all 4 aircraft were headed nonstop for the West Coast, they carried large loads of highly volatile fuel. The full force of their destructive power became apparent when Flight 175 hit the South Tower in New York. The resulting jet fuel fireball exploded downward into lower floors. Now, you know me, this ain't my forte about whether that was enough to bring the towers down. You know, if you want to make sure that the towers collapse, and by the way, that's the whole point, because symbolically, what if the towers stood? If we're to entertain that the towers came down by pre-planted explosives, dynamite, whatever, and what if the planes weren't enough? Because they didn't test this, right? There's no test. You know, there's no buildings in the world that they tested on, ran planes into the building, because there's no buildings like the World Trade Center ever. But to ensure the buildings came down, why not put bombs? Why not put dynamite or whatever to make sure the towers collapsed? Because symbolically, if the towers stood, what does it mean? It means to the people, hey, we took your best shot, and now it's our turn. With the towers collapsing, you know what that means symbolically? Hey, if we can get to your big buildings, we can get to you anywhere in the world. It's about demoralization. People get this wrong and say, oh, this is about thermite, this is about bombs, this is about, fighting the aficionado. It's all nonsense. Why did those towers come down? Did it just come down by jet fuel? Could have been. Could have been. You have to accept it. Could have been. I know you don't like to hear it, but I don't discount bombs or whatever, thermite, super thermite, whatever. It's not my forte. I'm not the authority on this. Near simultaneous departure and subsequent hijackings of the 4 plane, all of which took off within a period of 43 minutes, maximized the element of surprise, allowing the FAA little time to warn pilots in the U.S. airspace because it was an unprecedented operation. We never had multiple hijackings. Now, on top of that, we never had multiple martyrdom hijackings where the planes were intentionally crashing, killing everyone on board. It's never happened before. Afterwards, yes. German Wings 8925, for example. I'm sorry, PSA 1771. That's right. Was it a martyrdom hijacking? Well, technically it was. Guy wanted to kill himself. Hijacked the plane with a gun. Ex-employee, Pacific Southwest, right? Goes in there and shoots a pilot and he crashes the plane. But for a radical Islamic group to hijack multiple planes, and by the way, there were more than 4. Now we know there were more than 4 planes. If you haven't seen The Fifth Plane TMZ, please go watch it. Go to TJ Thermodetonator, my co-researcher, DJ Thermodetonator. Go to his channel, Truth to TV. Has the film right up there. The huge number of aircraft, more than 4,600 aloft over the continental United States, made it difficult for NORAD to identify the 4 rogue aircraft. Finally, the element of surprise reduced the time available to launch interceptors to divert or shoot down the hijacked aircraft, assuming that a decision to do so could have been made in time, and it wasn't, because Bush basically didn't talk to Cheney in time to give a shoot down authority, because Cheney doesn't have the authority because he's not the military chain of command. The president is. The president, Secretary of Defense, and NORAD. That's how it goes. Vice president, not military chain of command. Where was the president? In the air. Where was the Secretary of Defense? Outside the Pentagon. Where was NORAD? In the bunker. In Cheyenne Mountain. Where's the vice president? Talking with who? NORAD. Was he given a shoot down order? He can't. He has no authority to give a shoot down order. If he did, he's breaking the military chain of command. But if he was giving a stand down order at the Pentagon, was he? I don't know. But if it was a stand down order, there's no planes near Washington, D.C. So it wouldn't matter anyway, even though they knew that plane 25 minutes in advance was in Virginia and Washington airspace. 25 minutes after 11, not 175. I mean, and this was on the media. They knew about this. Reported 25 minutes. You're telling me they couldn't get defense jets in time to intercept 77? And Flight 77 is the most important plane of all, because the World Trade Center attacks were not an act of war. The attack on the Pentagon was an act of war. At Dulles International Airport, 5 hijackers boarded American Airlines Flight 77 bound for Los Angeles. Khalid Al-Mihdhar, Majid Baka, Dawaf Al-Hazmi, Salim Al-Hazmi, and Hani Hanjour, of whom the first 4 were subsequently listed as possible Saudi nationals. And they are. Although some of the men sent off metal detector alarms, they were passed through the security checkpoints. When the plane lifted off at 8:20 a.m. and had 64 people on board, a crew of 6 plus 58 passengers, including 5 hijackers with their weapons, probably small knives and box cutters. Now, there was a report of a gun on this plane. Was there? I'm not sure. In a speculative reconstruction of what took place in the plane, it seems likely that over eastern Kentucky, the hijackers made their move, probably between 8:51 and 8:54, and took over Flight 77. They either waited for a cabin attendant to knock on the flight deck door and then rushed the cockpit, or took an individual cabin crew member or passenger hostage and used threats against the victim to gain access. Once on the flight deck, the attackers either incapacitated or murdered the 2 pilots and then took over the aircraft. With 1 hijacker as pilot, the other 4 herded the passengers to the rear of the aircraft and forestalled any attempts to retake control of the aircraft before it reached its target. Under the control of the 5 terrorists, at about 8:55 a.m., Flight 77 turned south, and then 5 minutes later turned eastward from a point near the junction of West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. Hani Hanjour, who had received an FAA pilot certification, no doubt piloted the aircraft. No doubt? Now, there was a report of a 6th hijacker, and DJ Thermodetonator did a movie about this called 6 on 77, which was interesting because CNN reported this individual wearing black shirt, black pants as Hani Hanjour. No, Hani Hanjour was wearing a white shirt. He's bald and he was thinner. Well, the guy in the black shirt, black pants is Moshe Kanair. Who the hell is that? He's not even on a flight manifest. Why did CNN make him as Moshe Kanair? And who the hell is that? Well, nobody knew who that was. He goes in, he's on Flight 77. We don't know, right? Tracking Flight 77 would not have been easy, even if controllers had been able to identify the plane to follow. Its transponder, a transmitter that broadcast the course, speed, and altitude of the airplane, was turned off at 8:56 a.m. The hijacker pilot refused to answer any radio messages, adding to the uncertainty of making a decision to dispatch military aircraft to intercept the airliner, which made it harder, right? Because with no sheer way of knowing that this is a hijacked aircraft, We don't know whether it turned court. We don't know. For air traffic controllers, the lack of a transponder signal meant they could not find the Boeing 757 until it crossed the path of a ground-based radar. Now, the National Transportation Safety Board got the radar signal of Flight 77. The only problem is we don't know the altitude. We don't know the serial numbers of the plane. We only know about the dot on the radar. If the radar satellite operator is looking at that radar at that time and knows that dot is Flight 77, he's not going to mistake it for anything else. All right. And that's what happened. Daniel O'Brien, who was ATC, said that dot was going so fast, it looked like, that's what military planes look like. That's how fast they grow. Passenger planes are not supposed to go that fast near the Pentagon, which is unusual. She's right. In any event, these were not enough warning time for NORAD to take effective action. The only relevant action taken came in response to the erroneous FAA notice that Flight 11 was flying south toward Washington. At 9:30 a.m., Langley Air Force Base launched 3 F-16s that were still about 150 miles away from Washington when Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon 7 minutes later. The fighters had flown over the ocean in accordance with standing instructions and did not turn toward Washington until ordered to do so at almost the same time that the Pentagon was struck. The crashes into the Twin Towers, quickly perceived as terrorist attacks, were a call to action at the Pentagon. The acting deputy director for operations in the National Military Command Center, Navy Captain Charles Ledig, initiated a call for a significant event telephone conference of senior military leaders at 9:29 a.m. Ledig rejected the erroneous FAA warning that Flight 11 was heading for Washington. Even the Pentagon's National Military Command Center knew that plane wasn't 11 because it had crashed into the North Tower because he's watching the TV. And the FAA couldn't make this distinction. God sakes. And no wonder why they got ripped at the 9/11 Commission. They did. Monty Belger, the acting director of the FAA, was ripped by Bob Kerry. I have that uploaded on my channel. Go watch that. Oof. At 9:33 a.m., the Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport tower passed to the Secret Service Operations Center in Washington the alarming word that an aircraft coming at you and not talking with us. A minute later, the plane, Flight 77, turned south toward Alexandria, Virginia, then circled back to the northeast and flew toward Washington again. Its destination was the Pentagon, not the White House or the Capitol. The final minute of the airliner's flight took it along an northeast course above an Arlington County, Virginia roadway, Columbia Pike. County Police Department Corporal Barry Faust stopped at a traffic light at the intersection of Walter Reed Drive and Columbia Pike, less than 2 miles from the Pentagon. Spotted the aircraft flying low, saw a plume of smoke, then radioed, quote, "We just had an airplane crash. Must be in the district area," end quote. 3 blocks further along at the intersection of Columbia Pike with South Wayne Street, police motorcycle officer Richard Cox, no relation to Richard Cox, who's the co-host of The Darkened Hour, I assure you, observed the airliner flying so close to the ground that the polished underside of its fuselage reflected the images of the buildings it passed on its flight. Then he heard an explosion. Take that, no planers. I can't believe we still have these type of people. Here we have 2 eyewitnesses that saw the plane crashing into the Pentagon, right? Flying just above the Navy Annex building and a Virginia State Police radio mast, both uphill from the Pentagon and adjacent to Arlington National Cemetery, the hijacker pod guided the Boeing 757 downhill and turned it into a northeasterly direction. Less than 2 seconds before the plane hit the Pentagon, R.E. Regoblati, a building management specialist at the Navy Annex, peered out of his office window and saw the airliner looming over the building. Later recalling its screaming engines, he judged that the pilot must have pushed the jet's throttle to the limit. He estimated its altitude at less than 150 feet. In the Army Operations Center in the Pentagon basement, Brigadier General Peter Chiarelli was told by the intel folk that an aircraft was headed for D.C. and that it was right about then that we heard the noise and the building had been hit. More proof that the Pentagon was hit by an American Airlines commercial jet. What more do you people need? Others in the immediate vicinity who witnessed the impact recalled that the airliner struck several obstacles, including light poles on Route 27 on the way to its target. The right wing hit a portable generator, and the right engine crushed a chain link fence. The left engine smashed an external steam vault. Observers saw debris falling from the plane and the building. 5 images from a Pentagon security camera, approximately a second apart, recorded the approach, the crash, and the immediate effect, a huge fireball. Witnessing the fiery crash from above was the crew of a C-130 transport plane that had taken off from Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland, minutes before. As Flight 77 descended toward the Pentagon, it crossed the C-130's flight path. An air traffic controller asked the C-130 pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Steve O'Brien, to reverse course and follow the airliner. O'Brien turned and followed, watching in disbelief as Flight 77 smashed into the Pentagon. Is he lying? Is everyone lying here about seeing the plane crash the Pentagon? Ordered to leave the area immediately because fighter aircraft were approaching. The C-130 flew on to its destination, Minneapolis, St. Paul. Flight 77 hit the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. A description of the moment of impact on the building is contained in a report by the American Society of Civil Engineers, the Pentagon Building Performance Report. Quote, the Boeing 757 approached the west wall of the Pentagon from the southwest at approximately 780 feet per second. As it approached the Pentagon site, it was so low to the ground that it reportedly clipped an antenna on a vehicle on an adjacent road and severed light posts. When it was approximately 320 feet from the west wall of the Pentagon, it was flying nearly level, only a few feet above the ground. The aircraft flew over the grassy area next to the Pentagon until its right wing struck a piece of construction equipment that was approximately 100 to 110 feet from the face of the building. A tenth of a second before impact. A tenth of a second. How fast is that? At that time, the aircraft had rolled slightly to its left, its right wing elevated. After the plane had traveled approximately another 75 feet, the left engine struck the ground at nearly the same instant the nose of the aircraft struck the west wall of the Pentagon. Impact of the fuselage was at or slightly above the second floor slab. The left wing passed below the second floor slab, and the right wing crossed at a shallow angle from below the second floor slab to above the second floor slab. End quote. The impact proved devastating. The aircraft had taken off with a total weight of over 90 tons. 90 tons. Roughly 25% of it in fuel. Imagine 25% of 90 tons. What's that? 13%, maybe? I'm not sure. Allowing for the hour and a quarter flight from Dulles Airport to Kentucky and back. Flight 77 still had most of its original 7,256 gallons of fuel on board, the greater part of it in the wings when it hit the Pentagon, traveling at 530 miles an hour. When people say, why didn't we see wings or an engine? Large piece of the plane. It's because you're not going to find anything resembling a plane when the plane at 90 tons, holding 38,000 pounds of fuel, which is what 7,350 gallons is, crashing into a building at 530 miles an hour. And if you want proof of this, go to German Wings 8925, go to PSA 1771, and look at the debris at those sites. Do they resemble a plane? No, they do not. And I'm tired of repeating myself, stating that we're comparing plane crashes, intentional plane crashes, with unintentional plane crashes. It's disingenuous. The catastrophe might have well been even greater had the Pentagon been struck at either of the two Boeing 767s that crashed in the World Trade Center. These larger aircraft, carrying thousands of gallons more fuel than the Boeing 757 that departed from Newark and Dulles, would have done far more damage. I didn't know that. Flight 76 struck the west side of the Pentagon at the first floor level, just inside Wedge 1 near the fourth corridor, and proceeded diagonally at approximately 42 degrees angle toward the fifth corridor in the mostly vacant and unrenovated Wedge 2. After the nose of the plane hit the Pentagon, a huge fireball burst upward and rose 200 feet above the roof. Multiple explosions occurred as the plane smashed through the building. The front part of the relatively weak fuselage disintegrated. Right, it would disintegrate, because the plane basically going 530 miles an hour, holding 38,000 pounds of fuel, isn't going to survive. It was a miracle they found even seats or human remains. Light objects survived, shoes of passengers, even a leg. When I interviewed the Pentagon Incident Commander, James Schwartz, he said, to my disbelief, that they found a partial body of a passenger, a woman. But the midsection and tail end continued moving for another fraction of a second, progressively destroying segments of the building further inward. The chain of destruction resulted in parts of the plane ending up inside the Pentagon in reverse of the order they had entered it, with the tail end of the airliner penetrating the greater distance into the building. Remarkably, these circumstances meant that the bodies of the passengers in the rear of the aircraft traveled deeper into the ground floor of the building than did those in the front. The largest concentration of body parts was found at the deepest area of the penetration, the C ring. While the immediate building interior area hit by the nose of the aircraft was small, the section subsequently wrecked by the larger plane debris and multiple explosions of the jet fuel from the ruptured tanks seconds after impact spanned a larger irregular area of more than an acre on each of the first and second floors. Office spaces and corridors on these floors accounted for the locations of all but two of the Department of Defense victims. On the ground floor, the impact damage extended as far as the inner wall of the Pentagon C ring adjoining A&E Drive, a depth of 210 feet. Although the plane traveled about 270 feet along an angled path into the building, A&E Drive and wedges 1 and 2 marked the C ring back end of the first and second floor areas that suffered almost all of the fatalities. Impact damage on the second floor proved much more limited than on the first floor, with no supporting columns destroyed at a distance more than 50 feet from the outside wall, because on the first floor, there are no walls. On the second floor, there's a wall. Third floor, there's, the rings go up. But there's no wall on the first floor. It's clear straight through to A&E Drive. There's people that say, oh, there's these walls that the plane had to go through. No, not on the first floor. Above the second floor, most of the damage in the D and C ring resulted from fire and smoke and collapsed ceilings and light fixtures. The velocity of the plane's fuselage expended itself by the time it reached A&E Drive, which dissipated the remaining explosive energy of the crash. But the blast had enough force left to blow holes in the single-wing wall, which we saw, and force open the doors of an electrical vault opening into the drive. The openings proved the salvation of many survivors. Parts of the aircraft, including a tire part, hurtled through the outer 3 rings of the Pentagon offices, emerged from a so-called punch-out hole in the single-wing wall, which is the famous hole, and some people claim, no, that's the impact point, and they're wrong. That's the exit hole through the fuselage and the landing gear, the front of the plane, all traveling through with the explosion carrying all that weight right through, and the punch-out, which came to a rest in A&E Drive. That's the photos we see. The plane's voice recorder and flight data recorder were not recovered until 7 days later on September 14, 2001. Now, the flight data recorder was, we got some information, but the cockpit voice recorder, we couldn't, it didn't survive. The report of the American Society of Civil Engineers concluded that the direct impact of the aircraft destroyed the low capacity of about 30 first floor columns and significantly impaired that of 20 others. Moreover, this impact may have also destroyed the load capacity of about 6 second floor columns adjacent to the exterior wall, shattering the many columns, essentially doubled the span between columns, thereby imposing severe stress on the stability of the affected building section and causing collapse of the first floor floors in the E ring above the impact point at 10:15 a.m. Because without those columns, there's nothing that holds up the building. It just collapses. The collapse started with the second floor just up north of Corridor 4 along an expansion joint in the E ring and opened a hole to the outside about 95 feet wide at the first floor level. The collapse zone extended approximately 50 feet from the outside to the still standing E ring wall. The 95 feet wide would resemble that of the plane's impact, which, according to a 757, is 110 feet wide. The D and C rings did not collapse. The low hit reduced the damage visible from outside. No building could have absorbed the energy of such a crash without suffering structural damage and, if occupied, casualties. Nevertheless, the Pentagon fared better than less sturdy buildings would have. The greatest power of the interior explosions was confined to a limited area bounded by concrete floors and sturdy walls. Major structural damage ended with the collapse of the impact zone. Additional damage incurred over the next 36 hours extended deep into the Pentagon, with a considerably larger area beyond the impact site damaged by fire and smoke, as well as the water from sprinklers, burst pipes, and fire hoses. The worst damage came from the volume and flammability of the fuel rather than the structural strength of the plane, because the fuel basically mixed with other chemicals and whatnot, caused a hazard and, of course, the noxious fumes. And, of course, there were 24 people burned by jet fuel, but don't let that bother you, no planers, because missiles and bombs can't do that. Although never designed to offer the protection of a bunker, the building's steel-reinforced concrete and brick construction protected most employees in Wedge 1 and 2 from fires and explosions and saved their lives. Moreover, the rigidity of the Pentagon's facade caused some of the fuel in the wings to detonate on impact, diminishing the inside destruction and probably reducing the number of dead, all 64 on board the plane and 125 from the building. The lighter structure and largely glass facade of the World Trade Center buildings presented much less impact resistance. In other respects, the structural strength of the building proved a mixed blessing. Concrete and brick, not yielding easily to the energy of the impact, channeled the ensuing explosion and flames along paths of less resistance. The new windows, frames, and walls in Wedge 1 held up under extraordinary pressures, but they diminished, venting off the fire's heat and smoke. Consequently, the explosions constrained energy coursed through offices, corridors, elevator shafts, and stairwells where doors offered less resistance than concrete. The furious energy of the explosion made the bottom two floors in the immediate vicinity of the crash site death traps, compromised stairwells as escape routes, and made firefighting more difficult. The delay in the collapse of the E-ring in Wedge 1, almost 40 minutes, proved critical to the survival of occupants of the upper 3 floors, where the immediate impact of the plane claimed only 2 lives, both on the 3rd floor. The Pentagon's sturdy construction served to delay the collapse, affording time for hundreds of people on the upper floors to escape. The destruction, and importantly, the loss of life, would have been worse without the enforcement of the exterior wall of Wedge 1 and installation of the blast-resistant windows and fire suppression systems. Hitting just inside Corridor 4 in Wedge 1, the plane penetrated into the unrenovated Wedge 2. On September 11th, the offices in or near the impact point were not completely occupied, either awaiting new tenants in Wedge 1 or mostly vacated in preparation for renovation in Wedge 2. Had the aircraft had hit fully occupied unrenovated Wedge 5, several hundred yards to the right, the total of dead and injured, as well as structural damage, would have been much greater. If the plane had missed Wedge 1 entirely and plowed through only unrenovated and nearly vacated portions of Wedge 2, the structural and fire damage would have been far greater, but the death toll might have been less. No matter where it might have struck the Pentagon, Flight 77 would have wreaked havoc. And so that ends for Chapter 1, Part 2, Pentagon 9/11, the attack. And I will read from Chapter 2, Part 1 in a future video. And as usual, I'll always link information at the bottom of the description. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.